Good evening and welcome to a webinar, Solvable, How We Healed the Earth and How We Can Do It Again, featuring Professor Susan Solomon. This is presented by the MIT clubs of Western New York and Rochester, New York, as well as the MIT Alumni for Climate Action. I'd just like to give a brief introduction and give Professor Solomon as much time as possible to inspire us. Susan Solomon is the Lee and Geraldine Martin Professor of Environmental Studies at MIT and current chair of the program in Oceans, Atmospheres, and Climate in the Department of Earth, Atmospheric, and Planetary Sciences. And she's probably best known for her definitive work on establishing the mechanism by which chlorofluorocarbons created the Antarctic ozone hole. Among other awards, she received the U.S. National Medal of Science, the nation's highest scientific honor, in recognition of that work. She's been active in communicating science to policymakers, including involvement with the Montreal Protocol and the International Panel on Climate Change.
Well, thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and thank you for inviting me. I'm really deeply honored to have a chance to talk to this group. I'm so pleased that MIT has alumni associations that are active and doing interesting things like this. So thank you. As was mentioned, I am best known for my work on the Antarctic ozone hole. And I think it's fair to say that the story of ozone depletion and the fact that we are now on course to heal the ozone hole has been the signature environmental success story of the world, really. And my involvement with that got me interested in understanding other issues. I also do some work on air pollution, and I did quite a bit of study on understanding exactly how we stamped out smog, and I'll tell you about that one. I also have, we'll just hold up as another example, the fact that we got rid of lead in paint. It's so amazing to look at an advertisement like this and think that we used to advertise in a proud way the idea that we had a high lead content in paint. And of course, we also phased it out of gasoline. And I can remember filling my car in pumps that looked like these. DDT is another one. And I'm going to talk a fair amount about DDT because that's one with a very interesting MIT connection. So I would love to spend time on all of these and more. One could talk about species recovery and many, many other things, but I won't have time for that. I'm just going to talk about a few of them. So those are examples of the case studies that are dealt with in my book, Solvable. And it's really about how we are doing as stewards for the planet. How is it that we sometimes can actually get to environmental solutions. And what does that tell us for climate change? I talk about that in the book as well. So we're not perfect, but in my opinion, we're doing a reasonable job so far in managing the things that we are throwing at the planet. I'm going to talk about common factors that I believe contributed to success and sort of a foundational view of how success happens. And I talk about that as having 3 P's involved. It needs to be personal to people, perceptible to people, and there needs to be practical solutions. Can we still do it? I'll give you a short example of a recent international agreement that's actually a binding international agreement on certain kinds of greenhouse gases, and I'll talk about climate change. I want to note this book is not a guidebook for the energy transition. Some people look at the title and they think they're going to get a list of all the things that need to happen in order to solve climate change. That's not what it is. It's really about the social factors that have to align in order to solve environmental problems. That's at least how it's been for every major problem in the past, and I think that's certainly how it is for climate change. So I'll start with the stratospheric ozone layer. As you probably know, this is sort of a typical ozone layer. We talk a lot about ozone smog down here, but not much of the total ozone protecting us from the sun is in this low altitude pollution layer. It's mostly in this layer way above our heads, between about 15 and 30 kilometers. And we first started worrying about the stability of that layer in 1974, when these two scientists published a landmark paper in Nature that later won them a piece of the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, on the fact that man-made chlorofluorocarbons were being added to the atmosphere in steadily increasing amounts, especially in the 60s and 70s. We were just using them in extremely large values. So a lot was being emitted for things like solvents, refrigeration, and air conditioning to a small extent. But the big one in those days was spray cans. They were the propellants in virtually every spray can, whether it was paint or oven cleaner or underarm deodorant or hairspray. And it was mostly actually those things in your medicine cabinet that were the main uses. I'll talk about that some more. The key problem is when you're continuing to increase these things, and they have long atmospheric lifetimes, some 50 to 500 years, then they're just going to keep building up. What you put in the previous year, almost all of it is still there the next year, and it just compounds like a balloon mortgage. And they pointed out that it could deplete stratospheric ozone. This was only a theory at that time. It was far in the future, but it was enough to get people's attention, because I think we all know that sunshine in large amounts is not good for us, and the reason is because of ultraviolet light. That situation would be much worse if we didn't have an ozone layer. The fact that life was able to evolve on Earth at all is due to the fact that we have an ozone layer that blocks most of the ultraviolet from getting to us. But some of it gets through, and when it does, as you know, you can become sunburned, which is not only painful, but if it happens too often, damages the DNA in your skin, and you can end up with skin cancers. You can also get cataracts. I personally have had them early because I got too much sun, and perhaps especially when I was down in the Antarctic, actually, under the ozone hole. But so I wasn't careful enough, I admit it. But nevertheless, I just want to mention that you really do need to protect both your skin and your eyes from UV, even in a normal ozone layer state. But, you know, certainly the idea that there were rays from the sky that could cause things like skin cancer and cataracts made this issue deeply personal right from the get-go. So my first P comes in right there. It was personal. We expected that if we kept using chlorofluorocarbons and compounds containing bromine, which are called halons, that they might deplete the ozone layer. We might have a 5 to 10% depletion in 100 years. It was only a theory. It was far in the future. But it was enough for people to get nervous about these molecules, partly because they were made in the lab, and we have this feeling, I think, deep in the amygdala about the idea that things made in the lab might not be good. We were using them, as I said, for these remarkable hairstyles, and people made the decision in the United States to simply change their practices. So when it was clear that this was a problem, the National Resources Defense Council got actually very involved in getting people behind the idea of making changes and getting rid of their spray cans. And people actually gave up spray cans of things like hairspray. And they gave up spray deodorants. There was an advertisement that said, get on the stick to save the ozone layer. So people actually bought stick deodorant instead. These were easy things to do, and they were incredibly important, as I'll show you in a few minutes. So even though this was only a theory far in the future, people took action. Because it was an easy action. But interestingly, it didn't happen everywhere. The change in spray can use occurred in the United States and a few other countries, but not in, for example, continental Europe. So it was not uniform. But suddenly in 1985, everything changed. It wasn't 5 to 10% in a century we were talking about. It was 50% now, and in a place where no one had ever expected it, the Antarctic. So this is sort of a warning that environmental problems might turn out to be a lot worse than you think. not 5 to 10% a century from now, but 50% now. That is a wake-up call. And it was a very perceptible wake-up call to people. You could point to things like the satellite images that show these this incredible absence of ozone. It's not completely absent, but it's much less than the surrounding regions. It's down by about 50%. You could also point to data from this station right here by the British Antarctic Survey. They've been measuring ozone for, since the 1950s. It was pretty constant for about 20 years. And then it took this sharp drop. These are the October monthly averages. And you can see that it's stayed low, although it may be just starting to recover. Same kind of thing at the Japanese station, confirmed those data even before actually the satellite data came in. And the same kind of thing from the American station. So it was a graphic image. It was easy to understand. It made this into a hot crisis, and it became very perceptible to people. So my second P is satisfied here. I was very fortunate. I was a young scientist. I was 30 years old in 1986, and I was chosen actually to be the leader of the U.S. National Ozone Expedition. And that's a picture of us arriving in the Antarctic in August. It's noon. The sun isn't getting above the horizon yet. That's a truck headlight there behind us, not the sun. And the temperature is minus 40 C, which is also minus 40 Fahrenheit. It's, by the way, the only temperature at which they're the same. So if you're ever on Jeopardy and the final Jeopardy question is, at what temperature are the Celsius and Fahrenheit scales the same? The answer is minus 40. And it's cold. It was a remarkable, wonderful experience to go to the Antarctic. It's a fantastic thing for any scientist to do. The reason we were there was to look at the chemistry of the Antarctic stratosphere. And I had actually written a paper shortly before I led the expedition, and this is probably what I'm best known for, on the idea that surface chemistry might be why Antarctica was special. So Antarctica is extremely dry. And I should also say the stratosphere is extremely dry. And it's only in Antarctica in the winter and spring that it gets cold enough to form these clouds at stratospheric altitude. So if you think about it, if you're ever on an airplane going to Europe, you'll fly probably very close to the base of the stratosphere. If you look up, you're very unlikely to see any clouds. In Antarctica, when you do, you would see clouds in the right time of year. So it's that extreme cold that is critical, along with the man-made chlorine. Chlorine in today's atmosphere is about 85% man-made. There's a small natural contribution, but it's very small. And sunlight is important. I'm not going to show you the full details of the mechanism, but it makes the chlorine just much more damaging in extreme cold. And that's why the ozone hole opens up every year in the Antarctic winter and spring. This was easy for people to understand. You don't really have to, know the details of the chemistry. You just have to see those pictures of the ozone hole. So it was communicated pretty quickly to governments and to citizens. And what happened was that the nations of the world met in 1987 in Montreal to try to figure out how to actually have a protocol to get rid of these molecules, an international agreement. If there had never been a protocol, the amount of chlorine in the atmosphere would have done this. So by about now, we would be way up here instead of where we actually are, which is following very close to the zero emission line. But the original protocol actually, interestingly, only mandated a freeze, meaning that countries could only produce as much of the damaging chemicals, the chlorofluorocarbons are the main ones. They could only produce as much of those next year as they had the previous year. And that meant, because these have very long lifetimes, that they would still build up and it would have, eventually caused problems. But they met over and over again and eventually decided not just to freeze it, but actually to phase it out. And the same kinds of discussions are going on now, actually, with respect to the issue of plastics. There's going to be a plastics convention announced at the end of this year. I'm going to be very interested to see what that convention looks like. Of course, we have the Paris Agreement, which is also trying to turn the corner and begin to phase out CO2 emissions. What an agreement like that does is to send a strong technology forcing signal to industry. I call it technology forcing or technology steering. The idea is that, industry pays attention to this kind of thing because they can see that, when a UN agreement happens, there's a lot of consumers out there that are going to change the way they buy, and a lot of countries that are going to change the way they have policies. And that means that they're going to have to change the way they do business. So sending technology forcing signals to industry via agreements, even a non-binding agreement like the Paris Agreement, is a very important step, in my opinion. Montreal actually accelerated the phase out so fast that these reductions happened faster than anyone imagined that they could. By 1999, even the developing countries had agreed to phase out completely. So with zero emissions and these compounds having lifetimes of 50 to 500 years, this is the line that we're going to be following. It's a little bit more than the zero emission line, but not by much. There's been a little cheating, but not very much. Okay, so what that means is that the ozone hole ought to be starting to heal sometime around 2060 or so, and I hope to live long enough to maybe see it really start to heal. So how did this happen? I think what I've shown you is that the science mattered, the governments mattered, industry and technology mattered and responded to governments, but we are foundational to the governments, at least in any democracy. I think it's fair to say that the reaction is to what the people do. And in this case, the Montreal Protocol was signed in 1987. But take a look at the metric tons of CFCs sold as a function of year. This is the total, the rest of the world, and the United States. And what you see is that right around 1974, sales that had been growing steadily, this is good business, suddenly started dropping and dropped tremendously. And the reason is that consumer is not because the ozone hole was discovered. That didn't happen until around here. It's because of that theory of possible ozone depletion, just a theory. It was enough to get people to go to their medicine cabinets and take this stuff, throw it away, and put in that stuff. I mean, obviously, that was not difficult, but still, it's interesting that the consumers were willing to do that. And it was important. It was a big part of the reason why the United States was one of the leaders in developing the protocol. The U.S. companies really had to get out of the business. They don't want to stay in the business when they have more capacity to make the product than is able to be sold, and that's what already had happened back in this period. So there's rumors out there about how, the U.S. companies were ahead in finding the substitutes. I can tell you from the many years I've been in this business, that isn't true. All the companies knew what was going to be required to make the substitutes. It's not that complicated. But the U.S. was the group that was not making money off of them. Practical solutions were widespread. Technology steering by the Montreal Protocol worked. After spray cans, one sector of use after another changed, whether that be refrigeration, air conditioning, foam blowing, solvents, whatever you want to talk about. In the case of spray cans, we now no longer use CFCs in them. In the case of foams, like the styrofoam that your Big Mac used to come in, now it's cardboard. That, by the way, was partly inspired by protests. There were protests against McDonald's to get rid of those foam containers. Cleaning solvents, actually even in cleaning electronics chips, lemon juice is actually remarkably effective and is now used in many applications. Refrigerants has been one of the hardest ones. Initially, they were replaced with HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons, but it turns out that those, so if you have fluorine and no chlorine, that doesn't deplete the ozone layer. But these molecules are greenhouse gases. So the nations of the world who were involved in the Montreal Protocol actually said, hey, let's have an amendment to our protocol. We're going to have a Kigali amendment. They met in Rwanda, Kigali, and they decided to also phase out the HFCs. I was shocked when the United States ratified that amendment. I really thought we were going to kind of align ourselves with the amendment's requirements, but that it would take decades before we actually ratified, because we are so bad at coming up with a ratification of an international agreement. We haven't had one like this in about 30 years. We ratified it in 2022. So just a few years ago, a major international binding agreement was passed to phase out some hydrofluorocarbons because they are greenhouse gases and contribute to climate change, not because they do anything about the ozone layer, but because the ozone layer is actually what caused these molecules to begin to be used in larger and larger amounts. And if we kept using them, by about 2050, they would probably be contributing about 0.5 degree of warming. That's too much if we want to avoid, say, 2 degrees. So that's not going to happen. The Kigali Amendment is international law now, and it's being replaced by hydrofluoroolefins, which have very short lifetimes, just a few months, and are not significant greenhouse gases. There's other ways to replace them too. So we really did save the ozone layer. The 3 Ps were important. Citizen engagement was key. Definitely what citizens do, even if you only change the market of something by 5 or 10%, that is important. It sends a message to industry. Industry will generally be reluctant, even in the best cases, and certainly the chemical industry is a best case. It's a small industry, and I'll talk about the magnitude of the massive climate change and CO2 industry later on. But technology steering policies are definitely key. And certainly industry and environmental groups were aligned in making this change. We need to be able to build those kind of agreements. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about smog. Air was so thick you could taste it in the United States. It's a picture of Denora, Pennsylvania. It's also, of course, famous in London for its smog. And, of course, the Los Angeles smog made that city look like Beijing and New Delhi do today. Essentially every day was acrid and horrible, and asthma was growing in children. Nowadays, that's not the case. We really did manage this problem, even though you can still have bad smog days. And in fact, wildfires are now causing bad smog days. That's a different problem. But let me talk a little bit about why LA is the way it is. It's basically in a basin formed by the mountains. And what that means is that the wind from the west pushes the air up against the mountains, but it really can't get across the mountains very easily, and it just builds up and creates this horrible mess. Also, as I'll talk about in a minute, the large number of cars in the LA area is a big problem. People die in smog events. People are very concerned about it now in developing countries where they're having the same problem. So it wasn't until 1952 that we actually understood why Los Angeles smog happens. We'd lived with this problem for more than a decade. By 1958, LA had 219 stage 1 smog alerts. Those are days when kids can't play outside and people with respiratory illnesses are advised to stay inside. But by 1990, it dropped to just 4 per year, and now there had been none since 2003 until the 2020 wildfires. So kids can now play outside most of the time in LA. It's clearly a personal issue. If you live in places like that, definitely perceptible. You can see it and smell it yourself. You don't even need science to explain it to you. LA still has the worst air in the US on average, by the way, but much better than before. So I always say that science alone is never enough to solve an environmental problem, but it's always necessary. And I want to give credit here to Hagenschmidt, who was a great scientist from Caltech. And he's the guy who figured out that the reason for LA smog was different than the London smog. It wasn't from burning coal. It was from the combined action of nitrogen oxides and organics that were being emitted by all of those cars in the presence of sunlight. So he did experiments that proved it. He was actually a plant scientist who worked on aromas, And he figured out that LA smog didn't smell like sulfur in London smog, which is pretty cool. He used actually rubber cracking as his method of measuring the ozone, which is pretty cool too. He was a great showman. He used to make smog during his lectures. I wish I could do that for you tonight, but I can't. The other reason why people became, I think, very interested in this is that at the end of World War II, we had a period of very rapid growth and change. And with that kind of rapid growth and societal change, there's generally a dawning of reflection on it. You see the same kind of thing happening today in China. Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring, which awakened the world to the idea of environmental damage, and I will talk about that in just a few minutes. People were basically asking the question, is this the way to live? You know, is this worth it? Should we make some changes? And the foremost people making those questions important were actually a group of women. It was a group called Stamp Out Smog. It was led by a woman named Marge LeVay. She was the wife of a Hollywood film producer, and she got a group of Hollywood women together. Instead of writing letters and things like that, they went to hearings and marched with their children. There were scenes like this one. It was socially acceptable women's civil disobedience. It was a way for them to be part of the social movement that was going on around Vietnam, which I'll talk about in just a second. In this era of the 60s, people really wanted change in the United States. They linked up with garden clubs, broadened their membership tremendously, and they were able to really influence this problem quite a lot. General Motors, by the way, was America's #1 company in the 60s and 70s. We're not talking about a small company like the chemical companies here. This is the #1 Fortune 500 company, and Ford wasn't far behind. They were strenuously resisting any change, but they were faced with a massive social movement. Not only Silent Spring, but also the anger about the Vietnam War, the interest in women's rights and civil rights. All those things were motivating Americans to ask questions and demand change. And they also demanded change regarding environment. So that was something that got the attention of politicians. And I want you to just quickly run your eye over this quotation while I take a little drink of water. So when you read this, you might think that this is, an essay by the president of the Sierra Club or something like that. It's not. It's actually the State of the Union address by Richard Nixon. Now, Richard Nixon, in my opinion, if you look at his writings and the things that he did later in life, was no real environmentalist. But he knew that he had to embrace these issues. That was how strong the popular will for this change was. And he also knew that his likely Democratic opponent would be Ed Muskie, who was known in the Senate as Mr. Pollution Control, and actually was the architect of the U.S. Clean Air and Clean Water Acts. Nixon later in life said, hey, the EPA is run amok. The EPA is full of extremists. He really was not for environment until the public made him be for it. So the power of public demand, I think, is very clear in this case. Practical solutions, my third P, comes in pretty quickly here. And the reason is because the Clean Air Act mandated that cars had to reduce the amount of pollution that they would be putting out by some 90% within about 7 years, I believe it was, the amount of carbon monoxide. Nitrogen oxides, I believe, was a little bit slower, but same kind of thing. It was very unusual for Congress to actually write into the act what had to happen, and it forced and steered the technology to the catalytic converter. Catalytic converters were not new. They were known and had been used, for example, in factory settings for a long time. What was new was putting them in a moving vehicle. And indeed, that did pose some engineering challenges, but it was done, and it only was done because of the technology steering of the Clean Air Act. You can prove that, I think, by looking at the patents on auto emission technology reduction. So if you take a look at the number of US patents filed as a function of year, it's really interesting how nothing happened really until the beginnings of the Clean Air Act. Then there's a period when innovation, oh, by the way, of course, Japan really wanted to become, to dominate our market. And so they were very big in this too. But then there's a period when not too much happened and nothing really picked up again until the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments, which made the requirements even stiffer. And there you see the technology picking up again. So if you think that industry is going to do things on their own without being forced to, I think that's a little too optimistic. If you think that policies can't steer technologies, I think that's too pessimistic. Clearly, technologies have steered policies. Even the monolithic big auto industry in the United States. Again, to just emphasize how unstoppable the power of public opinion was, the Senate passed the Clean Air Act in 1970 by a vote of 73-0. That's astonishing. Social movements, I've already talked about, are very important. Technology steering policy was very important too. So let me talk now about DDT a little bit and other persistent pesticides. Organochlorine pesticides include dieldrin and aldrin and others. And again, we can see these remarkable advertisements that we just cannot imagine today that people would ever have had ads like this. But DDT was viewed initially as one of the weapons that won World War II for us, because this is a picture actually of a soldier getting sprayed with DDT by an officer, I suppose. Or maybe, I don't know, is that a sergeant? I don't know how these stripes and things actually work. I guess it must be a sergeant. But anyhow, the point is that with the availability of DDT, we were able to actually effectively go into places that were tropical, that had a lot of mosquito-borne illnesses that would have really weakened our troops. And so we were able to do that because of the advent of DDT, just about the time of the beginning of the war. But after the war, people started using it in homes, and they also started using it to spray insecticides over a field of beans, as in this picture. We knew that DDT was dangerous. Chemical plant workers had died while they were making it. Farm workers became ill much too often, and diseases like Parkinson's have been linked to the use of pesticides. The question is, was the general public slowly getting poisoned? There's a distinction between acute clinical impacts, like the chemical plant worker who's so sick that he has to go to the hospital and may barely survive, and the subclinical impacts that make us just sick in general, and we can't identify why or how or what the cause is. So there were lots of interest groups here, some very powerful ones, not just the chemical industry, but also the agricultural industry, so farmers, again, a big American industry, and public health service, and of course, consumer groups. The first signs of a perceptible silent spring came when robins began to die nationwide, actually, and especially in the Midwest, where people were spraying DDT on elm trees to fight the elm bark beetle, which was causing the Dutch elm disease. So the thing about DDT is it's just like the CFCs. It has a long lifetime, and it just keeps building up in the environment. Not as many robins died in the first year of spraying as later, because the DDT was building up in the soil, as I'll talk about in just a second. This was missed because traditional safety tests, for example, by the Forest Service, involved applying the stuff on a plot and then counting the damage to wildlife. They did it just once, and if the wildlife counts were the same, then they said, okay, well, this is pretty safe. They did not account for the fact that if you kept using it year upon year upon year upon year, that you would be building up a potentially toxic thing, particularly in the soils, which would then be communicated to the insects, and then the birds would eat it, and the birds would die. And this is just a picture that was from an early paper at Michigan State University on this. It's also fat soluble, so it accumulates up the food chain. If you put DDT in the water, the concentration in the water is relatively low, but then it gets concentrated in the zooplankton and in the little fish, and eventually big fish, and eventually things like fish-eating birds. That's one of the reasons why eagles and raptors had big problems with their eggshell finning, because they have a much higher concentration in their bodies than the other animals in the same environment. Humans are also we're also accumulating DDT in our fats as well. That became deeply personal, particularly when it was known that actually DDT was in mother's milk. So along comes Rachel Carson, and she writes this incredible book called Silent Spring. If you've not read it, I really recommend that you do. She was an author at that point. She had been a writer with the Fish and Wildlife Service for many years, and reports of dying birds and dying fish had crossed her desk time and time again. She became the best known nature writer in actually perhaps the world, but certainly the United States. She wrote wonderful lyrical books about the beauty of the sea. There was no, it wasn't, those books were not like Silent Spring. They were just celebrations of the wonders of the sea. But they made her the equivalent of the David Attenborough of the time. And so she was pretty influential already, and she decided to write this book. It was rapidly attacked. The critics claimed that without these pesticides, America couldn't feed itself. The benefits clearly outweighed the risks. It would cost too much to do anything else. Sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? Kind of like the way some people talk about climate change. So what to do was the problem. She did talk about alternative pesticides. Obviously, one of the things you can do is just use a pesticide that's not long-lived. Use a short-lived one and it won't build up in the environment. That doesn't mean it doesn't have dangers associated with it, but at least it's not building up. And she was criticized with language that, frankly, we would find shocking today, such incredible sexist language. It attracted the attention of the President of the United States, at the time, JFK, and JFK then turned to his Science Advisory Board, and here's where an MIT connection comes in, because the chairman of his Science Advisory Committee, called PSAC, was Jerome Wiesner, who was a professor of EE at MIT, and later on an MIT president. And so they conducted an expert report on whether or not Carson was right, and basically the report confirmed her main points. This is just a copy of it. It was released in 1963. So the next time you're on campus and you see the Wiesner building, you can think about Dr. Wiesner and his views regarding the importance of controlling dangers arising from technologies, along with celebrating technologies. But DDT was still in use. Just because Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring and people became concerned, it actually didn't stop the use. What to do? Well, the Brookhaven Town Natural Resources Committee was a citizens group. They tried to stop DDT spraying since the 1940s, and nothing happened until a lawyer joined the group. They then, I'm going to have to speed up a little bit, I see, they realized that the way to get this done was to introduce lawsuits. They introduced a lawsuit in their own town, got a temporary injunction. When that happened, the Mosquito Commission switched to a safer and practical pesticide because it was more than a year that they couldn't use DDT. Eventually, the judge actually threw out the case because he decided that only the legislature could make policy, but it was too late anyhow. The commission never went back to using DDT because the delay from the injunction had forced them to do something else. So they found a new tool. They actually could win while losing. Eventually, they became the Environmental Defense Fund, a group that has about 2.5 million members now. They also instituted similar lawsuits in 65 different communities in Michigan. Many of those lawsuits ended up being dismissed as no longer relevant because the towns just stopped using DDT. So the lawsuit itself was enough to trigger change. How to take it to the national level? Well, Wisconsin was the place where they did that. Wisconsin has a special law that is that any Wisconsin citizen can ask any state department for a ruling on the applicability of a set of facts to any rule enforced by the department. And that the issue has to go through to the end. It can't get dismissed. So they asked the Department of Water Resources to decide whether DDT was a water pollutant because it was killing fish in Wisconsin. And that created a hearing that got a tremendous amount of attention, a lot of national publicity. The state of Wisconsin banned DDT before the hearing even ended, and so did Michigan. This is just the volume of information that was assessed in the hearing. DDT was effectively banned in the United States in 1973. That's a fairly long time after Carson's book. That's a decade. It was not the book alone. It was the combined power of citizens, science, and the courts to change what was then a massive industry. So let me spend a couple of minutes on global warming, if I may. As you know, the last 10 years have been the warmest since the late 1800s. The Paris Agreement goal is to keep global temperature change below 2°C and do our best to pursue 1.5 degrees C. We may not make 1.5, I think we won't, but 2 is certainly possible. It's been a very, very hot last year, the hottest year on record by a wide margin. People are still working at understanding that. We have many different greenhouse gases that change our climate. Methane is one, chlorofluorocarbons that I've just talked about that deplete the ozone layer actually also contribute to climate change. N2O is another one, but CO2 is the major driver, and CO2 is the only one that lives in our atmosphere for more than 1,000 years. And only CO2 is embedded throughout the global economy. So CO2 is definitely our biggest problem, although methane reductions can certainly make important contributions to solving the problem. It's interesting to look at ice core data for the last 10,000 years and see that nothing happened for a long time, and then boom. What we now have is about 420 parts per million, which is a lot more than that pre-industrial background of around 270. That's a critical greenhouse gas, and it forces climate change. It also acidifies the ocean. Actually, if you look at longer ice core records, it's more than we've had for 800,000 years. So when those guys were on the planet, we were at 270. Then the Industrial Revolution came along and kaboom, now we're up to an unprecedented level of CO2, unprecedented in at least 1 million years, I think it's fair to say. What that does is give us a different planet, and I think the big changes that we notice are in the extremes. It's not just that there's a small increase in the mean. When you shift the bell-shaped curve of, say, average summer temperatures over, what you get is a small change in the average, but you get a huge change in the record hot ones. And we're seeing heat waves that are just temperatures that we've never seen before, and under duration that we've never seen before. If you look at the summer temperature anomalies over the whole northern hemisphere, this is how many sigma out the extremes can now be. So we'll get another decade pretty soon. In Boston, that means we have a lot more days above 90. And if we keep emitting at high emission levels, you know, that's going to double in the next 50 or so years. It's already increased by probably 50% from what it used to be. It's getting to be deeply personal. Sea level rise accompanies that warming, as you know, and it's, I think, now clearly personal to most people in the United States. And it's perceptible. So we've moved on. The skeptics don't even say it's not real anymore. That, for me, is a huge gain. We're asking the question whether solutions are practical or not. What we're seeing is public demand among young people and older people. We are seeing a social movement arise. I think, like previous issues, that social movement needs to grow. It's the only reason why policy will happen, is if people demand that it happen. It's not just the young people, the citizens' climate lobby groups. I want to call them out as among those that really have done a lot for local action and local climate change. We've got a lot of infrastructure commitments, power plants, homes. How fast can these change, even if clean energy is cheap? How much do they actually have to is an interesting question. Calculations have been done that show that if all the standing infrastructure just decays away at its current lifetime, we could actually easily avoid 2 degrees, maybe even 1.5. So we don't necessarily have to get rid of what we already have. We just have to not build any more of these expensive things, and we need to not mine more of the fossil fuels that are causing the problem. So what we really need to do is stop building new fossil fuel infrastructure. And we particularly need to not burn all the world's coal. If we burned all the world's coal, global average temperatures would rise by 14 degrees Celsius. I mean, that's ridiculous. We really do have to keep it in the ground, and the fossil fuel companies have recognized that. People have recognized it. Governments have recognized it. By 2050, many countries have said, yeah, we're going to have net zero. Where we are now, well, we have the Paris Agreement, and that's the group of people that celebrated the signing of it. That's President Biden signing into law the rejoining of the Paris Agreement right after he became president. The Ukraine war has put some pressure on gas, but it's also put a recognition in Europe that they're only going to get energy security through renewables, and renewables have grown rapidly in Europe since the Ukraine war started. That's a bright spot. We have a really big bright spot in the United States, which is the Infrastructure and Inflation Reduction Acts. Electric vehicle support, tax incentives for renewables, improving the grid, battery development, hydrogen. There's a massive investment of about $1/3 trillion in the Infrastructure Reduction Act. Sorry, in the Inflation Reduction Act. And it's an act of Congress. It is not an executive order. No matter who the next president is, they can't just, strike it out. Only Congress can repeal an act. So I think that even if the pledges are not fully met, technology steering is underway and it's strong. You can really see that when you look at the price of solar energy. The way that it has dramatically dropped really reflects technology steering, not only R&D funding in this country and in Europe, tax incentives, pledges, Paris Agreement, EU policies, the IRA, the whole shoot and match. So if you're going to build a power plant today, you will not build a coal plant. It's not economic. People can talk all they want about bringing back coal. It's not going to happen because it doesn't make money. Even gas is more expensive than solar and onshore wind. Offshore wind still has a way to go. So, I think it's clear that the transition has started. We've already, by the way, changed the expected business as usual future from 14 degrees to from 4 degrees by 2100 to 3 degrees by 2100. That in itself is a huge achievement, and that's just from the growth of alternatives that has already happened. I would argue renewables are practical. They account for 30% of the total energy needs worldwide. They're growing at a remarkable rate. They're now the cheapest option for new power plants, not just in the United States, but actually in 75% of the world. We need to focus more on immediate targets and not 2050. The U.S. Inflation Reduction Act will help that. The European Green Deal will. The European Emission Trading and Border Tax will. It's putting a lot of pressure on CO2 emission reductions. We need to continue to ramp down and speed up that pace. We need to keep the public pressure on. And we can use our economic power. Everyone can do that. Choices of stock values. You don't have to invest in the ones that have fossil fuels. You can invest in the socially responsible ones. So there's much more to do, and more innovation is a must. But I would argue that we were on the road, and there's reason for optimism. Thank you very much.
Well, Professor Solomon, thank you so much for agreeing to do this and sharing your wonderful knowledge and hopefulness. There are a bunch of questions in the chat. What I'm going to try to do, because we're about 10 minutes before an hour is up, I'll try to pose some questions that capture a number of the things or touch on the things being asked. And then if people want to stay past 8, I don't know how available you are, Professor Solomon, but a little bit past 8.
Sure.
We can get, other questions as well. I think a big one is the size of the problem. And I'll ask, what specific measures or combination of measures do you recommend be taken to prevent the fossil fuel industry from effectively using its resources and size to promote the continued or increased use of fossil fuels?
Well, as I said, my book is not a guidebook to the energy transition. So I'm afraid, Jeremy, I'm not going to give you, the step-by-step answer that I know you really want.
Right.
I wish I could. I'm not sure anyone can, because what is possible, as I tried to emphasize, what is possible depends a lot on how much the public demands it. So I think there's no doubt we'll continue to see a relationship there, and that part is in our own control. What do I think you're really asking me what I think is the most important steps? I guess, I think the uptake of electric vehicles was promising in the beginning in this country. It has somewhat stalled, and that's because of chargers. We need to really take national steps to incentivize communities and states to have more chargers. Similarly and amazingly, one of the big obstacles to implementing the Inflation Reduction Act is actually permitting. We have a capability to add a tremendous amount of solar power. It's actually ready to go. In some places, it's already been built, and it's not getting connected to the grid. Why? Because of permitting. So we need to take federal measures to actually incentivize states and cities to speed up permitting for alternatives. By the way, the same problem exists in China, and I just want to emphasize that the biggest issue really is what happens in developing countries in coming years. And in China too, what's holding things up is not the federal system. It's actually the permitting, which is left to the provinces. So this is something that can be solved. I mean, I really believe that is solvable, and it should be solved in the next few years.
So that leads to this public policy question. Given the current political climate of anti-science, anti-regulation, is reliance on the same kinds of policy measures that have worked in the past a realistic working principle? So, what's the appropriate mix of federal, state, and local policy measures in light of the trends we're seeing, in our country today?
I mean, that's true. And I just want to emphasize that it's not only federal policy that matters. State policies matter a tremendous amount. As you know, in Massachusetts, we have a regional climate reduction system among the New England states that is important, and certainly measures taken by individual states are important. They're reducing the use of fossil fuels. The last coal plant, I believe, in Massachusetts closed recently. So, progress can certainly be made through policies at the local level, and that steers technology. And when that technology gets steered, frankly, it ends up getting imported, even to states that don't have, that don't incentivize those technologies, because as soon as it becomes cheap enough, they'll use it too. And the more you use, I mean, the first solar plant off the assembly line costs a lot of money, but the millionth one costs a lot less money. So the states who aren't participating benefit from those that are. And in the same way, the countries who aren't participating benefit from the ones who do. Europe has taken the lead in tremendous number of incentives for fossil fuel reduction. They'll continue to do that. They are a major market. The three major markets in the world are Europe, the United States, and China. Other countries matter too, but those are certainly the main consumers. So those measures still seem to be working. I would argue that the evidence that it's working is actually that curve that I showed you of the cost of solar energy. And I could have showed you a similar one on the cost of batteries. And battery technology is currently proceeding at an incredible pace. I think we're going to have much better batteries in a few years. They may not even be using very much. You'll probably still have lithium in your computer and in your watch, but you probably won't have lithium at the power plant. There's already a sodium-based battery system at a power plant in Georgia, much safer than lithium.
Yeah. Since you mentioned solar, there is a question here about pricing, not just the cost of the solar energy, but coupling it with the cost of the storage. That gets to a bigger question of intermittency. And you might be familiar with Mark Jacobson's work in that area. And And he has systems approach rather than, looking at it as energy source and storage. He has all kinds of district heat and thermal storage and other things. But I guess that the tough question is, how do you price it when you also have to worry about storage?
I'm not sure what you mean by price it.
We have the
whole system.
Yeah, the levelized cost of solar per kilowatt hour is one thing, but if to use the solar, you also need the storage.
Yeah. As it grows, as it becomes a larger share of the power supply, then the storage issues come in. So it's cheaper when it's a small portion of the power supply. The larger that it dominates, the more intermittency comes in. But again, battery systems are getting better and better. Yes, there are other battery systems that don't have to be, solid batteries. There's ways to do it with gravity that are being explored. I think there'll be individual solutions in different regions. I'm not so concerned that we're in a situation where the growth of solar is going to happen faster than we can accommodate the intermittency problem. The other thing we have to do, and it's not that hard, is to improve the grid. We need a grid that can transport the energy over much larger regions, transport the electricity over much larger regions. Sorry, I'm getting a little tired. And that can happen if we replace the current wires with carbon fiber wires. That is not that hard. It's not that expensive. And I won't be surprised at all if we do it in the next Infrastructure Act.
You mentioned that if we simply, going forward, build things that have lower zero carbon footprint, we don't have to concentrate as much as on converting existing infrastructure. So that raises an important point when you consider the cost of taking an old building and making it a zero carbon building versus starting from scratch. So does that say that the emphasis should be more on making sure we build new properly versus working hard to reduce the cost of converting older infrastructure, or
sure,
some mix?
Yes, and remember, the main growth of CO2 is not going to come from the developed countries. It's going to come from the developing countries who are still building out those systems. So the main thing that has to happen is for them to build it clean.
Thank you. Another thing you mentioned in the technologies was hydrogen, which is kind of a hot button in that the hydrogen industry is selling it as the replacement for fossil fuels. And if you read Mark Jacobson's work, or people have dug into this a bit, the concern is how much renewable energy would be required to make the energy that you store in the hydrogen and then use the hydrogen.
Yeah,
so
I know. Look, I mean, I mentioned hydrogen only because it's part of the IRA. I'm not saying that that's something that I think is necessarily a great thing. I'm doing research on hydrogen too, and one of the problems that you have is that it actually also has an indirect greenhouse effect, which is not completely negligible. So it's sold as perfectly green when in fact it is not.
Yeah. How do we deal with that?
These are all things we're going to need to come to terms with as the prospects for hydrogen become clearer. Right now, the level of investment in hydrogen is actually rather low, despite the Inflation Reduction Act. So people are understanding these problems. Of course, the other issue with it is there's lots of issues with it.
Right.
I think we know that it's not going to be as successful as some people make it out to be.
Yeah. And then a last question on that kind of thing is other kinds of promises, silver bullets, that go into things like putting aerosols in the atmosphere or growing algae in the ocean to sequester carbon. And there are people who honestly believe that massive scale efforts of that type are the answer. Share your thoughts on whether we should be worried about people thinking about that, what we should do, or, is that, are those solutions not likely to make it far enough along for us to be concerned?
Well, I think those solutions are pretty crazy for many reasons. Certainly the idea that we just put stuff in the stratosphere, maybe we don't worry about the ozone depletion that's likely to result from the stuff we put up there. Even though we thought we solved that problem by getting rid of the CFCs, we're going to make it worse by adding these particles, which actually would, many of them, make it worse. That amazes me, but probably what amazes me even more is that if we do that, we are going to allow ocean acidification to continue because CO2 will just continue to build up, and that will cause biological damage in the ocean potentially. Every pound of CO2 that we add today will be around for 1,000 years. So we're basically investing in something that we then have to pay for in the end, even more. What we're kind of hoping really is that somehow carbon capture and storage, direct air capture will become so good by the time that we stop this geoengineering business that everything will come together. I mean, it just seems like, in my opinion, a mad gamble. And I'm just not prepared to risk the planet on something like that.
Yeah.
So what scares me the most, actually, is the fact that scientists talking about this stuff as if it was a good idea actually normalize the issue for the public. The public hears that and says, oh, great, scientists think they can solve this. I don't have to worry about it anymore. That is a horrible misuse of science because the problems have not been talked about enough. And the fact that, I guess I come back to one last thing. I think it's completely ungovernable on the international level. There's no way that governments of the world would ever agree to go with geoengineering rather than carbon emission reduction. And, having seen how long it took to get the Paris Agreement, having seen the kinds of things that had to happen for the developed and developing countries to agree, I can guarantee you there will never be a governance agreement for geoengineering. If you can't govern it internationally, how in the world are you ever going to do it? Because it would have to be governed internationally. It's a world problem. So I just don't see it, and I think we are dangerously misleading the public when we talk about it.
Thank you. Here's a question I think a lot of people are wondering, and it's free to take it or leave it, but how important is the upcoming election? Will the needed progress continue to be made regardless of who wins?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me just say that there is a satellite up there. It's already up there. It's going to be measuring methane at extremely high spatial resolution. It's going to be able to identify every leak that's going on. That's going to put enormous pressure on to stop those leaks. And I don't care who the president is, they will have to react to it. So that's already in the pipeline, and it's unstoppable. As I mentioned, the IRA is an act of Congress. There are things the president can do to try to limit its effectiveness, but he or she cannot repeal it. So it doesn't matter who's in the White House. And there's a group of 18 congressmen, actually, who just sent a letter to Mike Johnson saying, whatever you do, don't repeal the IRA. We love it. Why do they love it? Because it's bringing resources into their districts. And by the way, most of those are red districts. So, if 18 Republicans, I'm not sure I mentioned they are Republican congressmen who sent Mike Johnson a letter. If 18 Republicans are going to be saying don't repeal it, it ain't going to get repealed. I mean, unless there's a massive shift in the House, which we don't expect, I think. So I'm not saying don't worry, be happy. I'm just saying don't panic, because a lot of things are moving in the right direction.
There's one kind of related to this whole thing about scientists saying things that make you cringe, and misrepresent what we think good science is. On the other side, you have disinformation, deliberate. So this question is, disinformation is one of the biggest challenges impacting public opinion today. Do you have any examples of overcoming it from your experience?
Oh, interesting question. Disinformation. Oh boy.
Well, you might have, I think in your book you touched on things that happened in the CFC industry before they started agreeing to change. They started.
Oh, well, here's a simple one. Yeah, here's a simple one. In the early days, the producers of CFCs said there you had to have them because spray cans were important, and there was no way you could use anything else in a spray can and actually get it to work. Well, we still have spray cans. Actually, alternatives were developed very quickly. Things like propane as a propellant in a spray can is quite workable. So that's a very simple example. It's rife with that kind of stuff. I mean, the car companies, of course, dragged their feet and said that there was no way that the catalytic converter could ever be put in a car. And actually, the way that the EPA proved that you could put it in a car was they had their own lab and they put one in a car. They actually did it themselves. And so Muskie was able to tout that kind of information, and eventually the car companies began to compete with one another because they knew they had to, and then the ball was rolling. So yeah, plenty of disinformation from industry. I'm trying to think of a broader disinformation to the public. And I guess the best example of that really is that if you think about personal, perceptible, practical, in the beginning, the climate skeptics would argue, oh, climate change isn't happening. It's just not even happening. Warming, they would look at short periods of time when there was an El Nino in the beginning of the record, so it was warm, and a La Nina at the end, which was cool. And they would look at those, say, 10 or 12 years and say, look, climate change isn't happening at all. They don't do that anymore. They cannot get away with that anymore because it clearly is happening. So the misinformation was overcome by the growth of scientific information. Then you move on to, well, it's perfectly natural. Climate just goes through oscillations. You don't even hear that anymore. People do understand that it's caused by human activity. So, all those bits of misinformation get overcome either with time as the problem gets worse, which is kind of what's sadly happened with climate change, or by invention when, people invent ways to put catalytic converters in cars.
Yeah, instead of argue, come up with a solution.
Yeah.
A demonstration. Someone asks, I'm curious to know whether the recent lawsuit against the state of Montana would be comparable to the DDT lawsuit example in the context of, using the legal system.
It's an example, a great example of the way that people can get attention onto a problem by using their legal rights. So yes, I would say it's similar. It perhaps is less effective in the sense that it doesn't cause an immediate change, but it's helpful. It's all helpful in moving public opinion, which will cause change.
And any talk about alternative energy sources, always someone asks something about nuclear. And so there are a couple of nuclear questions here. One is just what your prediction is and what's going to happen with nuclear power as part of the mix. And then the other is, why is the price of nuclear going up? I think you can hit both of those.
Yeah, I mean, nuclear has become more expensive partly just because of security issues, which nowadays are very, very different from what they were prior to September 11th, for example. So that is one thing driving the costs in the nuclear industry. The other one is just popular, concern about the nuclear waste problem, even if there are better and better methods for managing nuclear waste. I think nuclear certainly has potential. I think one of the big problems is that we really have to get on with it in the next 15 years. If you think about it, turning the corner on CO2 emissions by 2040 and starting well down the emission curve has to happen if we're going to avoid 2 degrees. And I think it can happen. I just don't think nuclear can come on that fast. People talk about different types of nuclear plants that are more efficient, smaller, and all of that, and maybe cheaper as far as security costs. I don't know. But can they really help us in the short term? Maybe they can help us a lot in the long term, but I'm not sure about the short term.
Yeah, thanks. Let's see. I'm trying to. There are also comments mixed in with the questions, so I'm trying to. Here's one that goes back to ozone. Someone was asking early on when you were talking about the ozone layer, are there ways to help speed up the restoration of the ozone layer? The curves you shared still show the levels significantly below the starting concentrations.
It is true, and that's why we still have, the ozone hole is starting to heal. We see that on average, September especially, it's become smaller, and that's a good thing. But it won't, I don't expect it to heal completely for decades. There's no known active removal mechanism to get the CFCs that are already in the atmosphere out of the atmosphere. And that's what you would have to do. So my short answer is no, I don't see a way to really. The only other thing you could do, which is doable, but it doesn't help you that much, is to recoup and destroy the CFCs that are still out there in what we call the banks. And there's 2 kinds of main banks. One of them are the banks in refrigerators, and more countries are actually making more of an effort to recoup and destroy what's in a refrigerator when you get rid of it. That's a good measure. There's even, some old CFC-based refrigerators still around. And also actually the ones in buildings, air conditioning systems in buildings. But the other thing that is more difficult is CFCs in insulation foam in building walls. If you have a home built in the 60s or 70s, it probably has CFC-based insulation. And so that CFC is just leaking out slowly, and recovering and destroying that is a much more difficult proposition. You could do it when the buildings come down. Generally, that's not done, but it is doable.
Yeah. So it's basically a problem of the persistence of the CFC. I mean, we have to stop putting more because we can't get rid of what we have very easily.
We don't have a method to do it.
Yeah. Someone here is interested in biochar as a soil amendment. And it would be interesting if you had any thoughts on what this could do for groundwater pollution, using soil amendments to try to store carbon and possibly clean up stuff that's in the ground.
I'm not an expert on this at all, but I guess the thing I would say is most of what I've seen suggests that the solutions that involve trying to put more carbon in the soil are tough to verify, and that in general you get an uptake for a while, but then you get more emission of CO2 back from the soil later on. So the nature-based solutions, while they seem very attractive, really need a lot more work before they're going to be viable.
Thanks. Let's see, we might have time for maybe one more. It's almost 1/4 past. I'm trying to pick something fairly general. Here's one. Well, for Western areas with geothermal resources like California, Nevada, and possibly future Hawaii, Arkansas, Washington, etc., can it be economical for round-the-clock power, including peaking at night, etc.? Basically, asking if it could help the intermittency of the other renewables.
I mean, let me point out there are states that already get most of their power from hydro, and that doesn't have the intermittency problem. So, states like Idaho, state of Washington get most of their power from hydro. Indeed, you could well imagine places getting power from geothermal. People have even talked about tidal energy. So and obviously those solutions are only going to work in certain areas. So maybe indeed the solutions will be very locally based.